Welcome to the Frontline Herbalism podcast with your host Nicole Rose from the Solidarity Apothecary. This is your place for all things plants and liberation. Let's get started. Hello, welcome back to the Frontline Herbalism podcast. With the powers of the internet and scheduling, I'm actually sending this to you from the beach in Cornwall, hopefully. No, I'm just kidding. I've pre-recorded this little intro now, and I'm having a 2-week break, which is like a really huge deal for someone with very intense workaholism. So hopefully I'm having a good time and not struggling too much being away from my laptop. So this is part 3 of the webinar I recorded about state repression, trauma and the body. So this took place back in May and was kindly hosted by the Civil Liberties Defense Center and organised by anarchist friend and comrade Cindy Milstein in solidarity with the movement to stop Cop City. So yeah, this is part 3 and hopefully you've listened to the previous 2 parts. So the first part was looking at like the repression that I went through and its effects on myself and on the movement I was part of. And part 2 looks at trauma and the body. So we explore like what is trauma, some of the common trauma dynamics and how the body expresses distress. And yeah, a lot of these concepts were taken from my Herbalism, PTSD and traumatic stress course, which the waiting list is in the show notes for. Super excited to launch it this September. But yeah, this section is all about like collective responses to traumatic stress. So I introduced one of the frameworks that I talk about quite a lot in the PTSD course. We explore things like solidarity against state violence, its roles. And finally, we talk about some herbs, right? Some plant allies in solidarity against state violence. And then we have a few questions and answers as well. So yeah, you can, like I've mentioned before, you can find the link in the show notes to the webinar where you can watch it as a video. You can download the PDFs like the PowerPoint I made and also access the transcript and find all the other links. So yeah, please check that out. It's free, just needs your email address. There's also, I forgot to mention, there's also a workshop I did in 2020 online about herbalism and state violence for the New York Anarchist Book Fair. So yeah, you can access both of those at the same time and just kind of like binge on herbalism and state violence related things. No, I'm just... Okay, so I know it's not the easiest of content. I've given a content warning before, but there are kind of graphic references to heavy things around prison and repression and the body. I think it's really important listening for anyone engaged in the really challenging and rewarding and liberating and harrowing and stressful work of organising for social change in different ways and organising for liberation. Okay, enjoy, and I will be back soon. The next series of podcasts are all going to be about the Medical Self-Defense Network, and I'm going to introduce that soon. I've got some really amazing interviews lined up with medics all over the world. So excited to release it. Just need to do a couple more interviews and then it's finished. But for now, I hope you enjoy the series and yeah, take care. Okay, so I'm just going to move on to like some of the collective responses to traumatic stress. So yeah, in terms of state violence, which is like the context of this particular webinar, I just wanted, Cindy mentioned this earlier as well, but really like the state is trying to traumatize people, The language they use around our campaign was like decapitating the leadership. And yeah, their aim ultimately is to like counter threats to power, right? And yeah, I know like people on this call will kind of know this stuff, but just stating the obvious, but like the state really has the monopoly on violence and will use like all tools at their disposal to like maintain power and control. And repression like aims to dehumanize, humiliate, segregate, isolate, etc. And ultimately, like solidarity is like the main weapon we have to counter these state tactics. So yeah, what roles do you think solidarity plays in mitigating state violence? Again, I kind of wish it was like participatory, but have a little think yourself. I just kind of listed a few here, but there's obviously many, many more. And one of them is that rot doesn't grow where the sun shines. So like shining a light on like abuse and injustice is like a kind of form of solidarity against like organized trauma, you know, like organized state violence. We also have like practical care. So, you know, I think these are like the more obvious things that we do. So like police station support, accompanying people to court, like financial support, just kind of anything where we can support defendants to like regain a sense of control and agency, and feel like in general like more resourced. Like I mentioned already, like distress and trauma is like worsened by uncertainty and lack of information and loss of control. And yeah, political care. So, you know, like I mentioned with our case, it was like this lack of political solidarity, which was very harmful. So that might look like statements of solidarity, like solidarity actions, banner drops, etc., and just like pushing back on kind of liberal narratives around militancy, and trying to build things like unity in legal proceedings, for example. And then in terms of like emotional care, like, yeah, supporting the expression of feelings, like being a kind of, you know, accompanying someone on their journey of like distress and pain, someone knowing that they're not alone, and having like compassion for like learned survival responses, whether that is drugs or alcohol or workaholism or whatever, like having compassion to know that like if someone is going through state repression, like they are, you know, ultimately their kind of learned survival responses are going to kick in, and we need to understand that and be supportive, and not just kind of like, you know, abandon people. And just like generally like supporting people to access this like parasympathetic time. So this is times where someone may feel more safe in their body. It is telling their body that they're able to digest their food, to rest, to repair their tissues, for example. Yeah, and just like consistency, like refusing to abandon our comrades, supporting people to stay engaged and not disappear. So in my Herbalism and PTSD course, I kind of like developed a bit of a framework, which I'll talk through. And this was really built on the work of a friend of mine called Lisa Fannin, who has an amazing book called Warp and Weft. And she like just really goes into kind of like more like radical analysis around trauma in general. I really recommend you check it out. And it's also in an audiobook version. It's free online. So anyway, so these all go together and they're not linear. It's not like you rest and then you like engage in some kind of organizing, right? Like they all kind of like spiral. And it's not like once you've done one thing, you never have to do it again. Like these are like ongoing things that you kind of continuously engage with over time. And again, like the online course goes into it a lot more. But I really think like this kind of release stage is really important. So releasing trauma held like in the body, in the mind, the soul, and those things not being kind of separate from each other, and like releasing this like stuck kind of nervous system energy, and ultimately like releasing like anger and rage and different emotions. I think, you know, we live in a culture where our feelings are like generally very repressed, you know, where it's not actually safe to be an angry person, for example. You'll get kicked out of a group or whatever, but we're constantly dealing with all these huge emotions, and we need to be able to like release them in kind of like supportive collective contexts. So what are some of the like practical ways in terms of release? And again, I'm talking about these as like something an individual can do, but I also think they're all like collective things that, you know, are nourishing and strengthening when they're done with other people. I've said about expressing emotions, for example, rage on a demo. Maybe it's exercise or movement, sweating, you know, things like saunas, body work and breath work. Oh my God, excuse me, burping on the webinar. It's because I've eaten and I'm not in parasympathetic, so I'm not digesting my food properly. Creative practices, for example, like art or writing or music. This is like a really important way of like releasing our feelings and what's happening in our bodies. There's also these tools called trauma releasing exercises, which are very, very life-changing for me, whereby you kind of like tire out your own leg muscles in a way to like trigger shaking in the body, and kind of like releasing of trauma that's held in our tissues. And there's also tools like brain spotting and EDMR, eye movement desensitization and processing, whereby you're actually kind of processing traumatic memories. So I would encourage you to check those out. They are kind of being appropriated by things like the state to, make, people in the army who are bombing people or whatever, like be less traumatized by that. So, I think take all the tools with a pinch of salt. Counseling and talking therapies, and then herbs, right? Like, so plants can also support with release of emotions. Like maybe it's rose or hawthorn for grief, maybe it's burning herbs. There's different herbs that in this stage. And then I talk again, there's like a whole module on this in the course, but in terms of like rest and renew, like there are like different types of rest. It could be physical or social, like having time alone away from people. But it's about having this time where we're in this more parasympathetic nervous system state, where we're able to, digest our food properly, where we're able to relax our tense muscles. And yeah, like different strategies. So sleeping, napping, gentle movement, like trash TV, pleasurable touch, creativity, etc., saunas. And yeah, and again, as a herbalist, for me, this is all about like connecting with the land and non-humans. So if you've been someone who's gone through a lot of traumatic shit, then it might be really difficult for you to feel safe, like with other people. You might not enjoy socializing, but actually being on the land is going to be like healing, right? And for me with herbalism, it's not just like taking herbs, it's like the act of herbalism, like harvesting, medicine making, etc. And then the kind of like third bit of this like wheel model is about reconnection, right? It's about relationships. Like, ultimately we have evolved like through relationships. Like, even though we might hate it, we actually do really need people, and we also need non-humans. And in my course, I talk more about this polyvagal theory, which is like a kind of theory around the nervous system. And they have this concept of like safe and social as like a nervous system state where, like that's what we need. Sorry. It's okay. But yeah, classic example of safe and social. It's like you can't get to safe and social on your own. You have to get to safe and social with other people, because that's what the social part of it. So it's like we need relationships in order to heal. And yeah, they are absolutely like foundational for trauma recovery and like for life in general. And then, other tools that humans have developed over millennia are like rituals and ceremonies and different kind of strategies that, are an important part of reconnection. And yeah, in terms of stories, like to integrate what we've been through, like we really do need to share our stories with other people. And there's a little picture here of a campfire. Part of trauma recovery is really about tending to our wounds together, right? And deciding what action we can take. So it's like, if you've been attacked by a bear, you want your village to then protect you from that bear, right? Like you need them to take action, feel moved by what you said in order to keep you safe. And, we need also that validation and connection with others to heal. Okay, so like the fourth part of this little trauma response framework. So we've done release, we've done rest and renew, and then we've done reconnect about relationships. So the final one is really like resistance. So I really like this quote in this article, which is saying about this concept of trauma informed. And it says, just as Dr. King vowed to remain creatively maladjusted rather than numb, as long as there was discrimination, bigotry, income inequality, militarism, and violence, so might everyone reject those trauma-informed practices that leave individuals well-adjusted but inactive in face of oppression and trauma of all kinds, while the individuals and systems that give rise to trauma and oppression operate as usual. And I think that's really important, because it's kind of like, what is the point in healing and recovering if, it's other people are just, continually getting traumatized, for example. So, I don't want to spend like a decade trying to like navigate this PTSD and what helps and work with all these plants to understand this stuff if I then can't support people also leaving prison, for example. Okay, so in this context, like about resistance, like mainstream trauma therapies, like generally want us to adapt to a world that is fundamentally traumatic. And we know that like the world needs to be radically changed. And, many people engaged in organized, well, I would say, destroys us and what caused our trauma. So for me, that might be like ending prisons, for example. Someone else, that might be, like stopping the border regime or
you know, whatever, like there's so many different struggles, and like I said, they all intersect, but really, like, you know, it is about kind of creating a world that is less traumatic. And then just like beyond resistance, like it's not just about, you know, fighting the good fight, right? Like it's also about healing and building like liberating forms of collective life. But I know like probably many people on this webinar who, you know, who told me they were coming and stuff, like a lot of us are in like these kind of like social movement spaces, and we also need to acknowledge that like movement work can also be very traumatizing, like whether that is state repression or, you know, sexual assault or racism, or, you know, like all these different things like are also found in our groups, right, and in our movements. And I've put here like organizing and workaholism can be empowering, but can also be avoidance strategies for resolving pain. And maybe people saw on Instagram, but I put this very silly meme here with two people kind of linking arms saying capitalist workaholics and anti-capitalist workaholics, avoiding overwhelming feelings and unprocessed trauma as something we have in common. But yeah, being able to organize, to work with other people, like it takes a huge amount of energy, and it needs us to be able to take care of ourselves and each other, which is why I have so much gratitude for Cindy for like prioritizing this work, like making stuff like this happen. But okay, so another question for people. I'll have a little sip of water and a rest. But if you have come to this webinar as someone like engaged in some sort of political project or collective, or, you know, whatever structure you're doing, yeah, how have you found that work healing? How have you found that political organizing healing? I'll just self-mute for a couple of minutes while you think about that. All right. Okay. Oh, and this is the fun bit. So I just wanted to talk about herbs briefly as a herbalist who loves plants. And I've mentioned a few different times like that we need relationships to recover from trauma. And those relationships can really be with plants and non-humans as well as humans. So yeah, herbalism ultimately is also based on relationships. And with plants, like you are never alone. You know, you can always like outside, and that's really nice and comforting. And you know, like I see a lot of people in clinic or whatever, and they think the healing is the thing in the bottle, you know, that's given to them, and ultimately like it's just not the case. Like I think the act of herbalism is what is healing, right? You know, like whether that is identifying a new plant or foraging or making medicine, or, you know, making tea and drinking it with friends and having that chat, like all of these different things are what is healing about herbalism. And I've put here, plant medicines can transform your life by enabling a deeper relationship with the land, you know, which capitalism has ultimately like completely separated us from. Improving sleep and digestion, preventing disease, reducing inflammation, and aiding the nervous system to rest and recover while surviving and resisting this oppressive world. And there are many, many, many herbs that can support people through repression. And I just wanted to say that before taking any herbs, like please just check them out, that they're safe, that they don't contraindicate with your any medications you're taking, for example, that you're not allergic to them, that they're kind of good quality and kind of vibrant medicines, ideally from a local herbalist or wherever you can source them safely. And yeah, just to like do your homework basically before taking any kind of plant medicines yourself. But there's kind of like one group of plants that have a particular affinity with the nervous system called nervines. And again, my course just goes into these in so much detail, but they have different actions. So some of them are kind of relaxants. So they are helping us shift into this like parasympathetic rest and digest state. They're encouraging us to be less kind of activated, less hyper-aroused, less hypervigilant. And yeah, I'm going to talk about lemon balm more in a minute. And then we might have our cardiac nervines. So these are plants that have an affinity with the cardiovascular system and the heart, because the cardiovascular system is very impacted by chronic stress, you know, by kind of chronic inflammation from being hyperactivated in fight or flight all the time. So yeah, these plants have a particular affinity with those systems. So you're thinking things like hawthorn, which is in flower here now, rose and motherwort. Motherwort is really amazing for heart palpitations and kind of like anxiety that's like causing you chest pain. Obviously, chest pain is like a clinical red flag and you need to get that checked out. But it's a really amazing ally. And then for people in the UK, there's like linden flower, like lime blossom, which is also an amazing kind of antispasmodic and kind of vasodilator that can help like relax our blood vessels. And then you have like your more kind of like pokey, stronger nervines, which we would call like hypnotic nervines. So these are plants with a more kind of sedative effect. So one of them is skullcap. There's like hundreds of, I think there's like 80 varieties of skullcap. And it's a fantastic like restorative to the musculoskeletal system if you're in chronic pain due to like chronic stress, for example. Passion flower, which is really fantastic for like racing thoughts, for hyperarousal, for anxiety, and also for sleep. And then hops is like an amazing antispasmodic that's also fantastic for sleep. And then things like wild lettuce, which are really strong for chronic pain and for tension, for example. And again, my course goes into detail about all of these different herbs. But the other amazing action of herbalism is like nervine tonics, so plants that can help us actually like rebuild and repair our nervous systems, whether that's like the myelin sheath, which is like the kind of fatty layer around our nerve cells, or whether that's our brain health, for example. Like there's different kind of tonic herbs that can have like ongoing long-term roles in like kind of supporting our nervous system to recover, especially after chronic stress. So one of the most famous remedies is like milky oats, which is really fantastic and nourishing for the nervous system. Vervain, which isn't safe for people who are pregnant, but is a very very long used traditional nerve tonic, especially in England. It's considered very, very sacred herb. And then St. John's wort, which also has a lot of contraindications with people taking medication, but it's fantastic herb for the liver, really amazing antiviral, and is also, been shown to be very clinically effective in lots of people in terms of supporting people with like hepatic depression, kind of like liver depression. And then betony is another wonderful nervine tonic as well. I'm so sorry to not go into more details about them, but it's 9:15 already. So so I mentioned hawthorn, but hawthorn is one of the herbs I use in a blend called Braveheart Blend, which combines hawthorn, rose, and lemon balm to give to defendants experiencing state repression. It's amazing for inflamed blood vessels, for people with high blood pressure due to stress, also for people with low blood pressure. And it's in flower now. It's full of antioxidants. It's very nourishing and toning. Definitely, it's like, again, also very safe. And rose, as you can see from all of my shit all over the internet, I'm obsessed with roses. But these herbs have such an amazing medicine for the grief, for people who are grieving, for people who, cope with holding a lot of the harm in the world and witnessing suffering, for example. It's one of the herbs featured in my Prisoner's Herbal book. I make rose petal glycerite every summer. I make rose tincture. I add rose petals to tea blends. It's a really fantastic, accessible herb. And you can also get rose hips, which are highly nutritive, huge amounts of vitamin C and antioxidants, which are really helpful in times of chronic stress. And lemon balm is part of the mint family, and the mint family have huge amounts of affinity with the nervous system in general. It's really great in terms of hypothyroidism. It's really wonderful in terms of just supporting people to get into this more like restful parasympathetic state. And it's like a herb you can kind of take through the day, if that makes sense. Like it's not going to knock you out so you can't drive, but it's going to have this kind of effect on this like background noise, I call it, in terms of anxiety. And I've mentioned lavender already, but really, really, really underestimated, amazing herb. I infuse it with, I use dried lavender, like ratio 1:7 with organic olive oil. I get olive oil from Palestine. And it means that you don't have to worry about people like consuming it internally, but they can have like an oil which can help them with sleep and stress. And also oil is like really needed and craved by our nervous system. Like our nervous system needs oil and fat to function. So, okay, that's it on the herbs. I just wanted to mention about the course. I do this Herbalism, PTSD and traumatic stress course twice a year in March and October, and the next opening is in October, and you can sign up for a waiting list on my website for that. It's like sliding scale, like no one turned away for lack of funds. And yeah, it's kind of like 60 lessons all about like a deep dive into the nervous system, into our bodies, into how stress like creates chronic disease. I've also got a monthly newsletter. And yeah, I just encourage people, if you've got like the financial resources to distribute, then donations are really welcome. I use money to get books, the prisoners' herbal books to prisoners around the world. Also send these herbal medicine packs to different people experiencing repression. And yeah, so everything that I do is on this solidarityapothecary.org website. Sorry for running over a little bit. I guess now it is the questions. And I think Harvard's gonna facilitate that, right?
Yes. Hava, if you don't mind, although I could read the first question that's in the Q&A, and then maybe we'll try to do about 10 minutes and then wrap up, because keep it. So if anyone has questions now, type them into the Q&A, would be great. And I will read the first one, the one that is in there already. Someone asked, how best can you discern when someone has experienced trauma that needs more gentle versus active approaches? And does that relate to how recently trauma occurred, or does it vary by individual timing, trauma, and so on?
Yeah, that's really interesting question. And I think it actually responds to something I heard once, which is like, the slower you go, the faster you get there. Like, in the sense of like, actually anyone recovering from trauma generally needs things to go slowly, to be gentle. And that is part of learning how to live at a kind of different tempo, if that makes sense. So it might be that counseling needs to go very slowly, or introduce a new plant into your diet needs to happen very slowly, because there is this real tendency for big changes to cause people to kind of re-enter a state of like high activation. So I think in all cases there is like gentleness, if that makes sense. I'm not sure if that answers the question. But yeah, and I think also like the person that will hopefully know what they need, right, is the person. So always that person having as much agency and power to express like the care that they need. You know, it might be that someone is like, you know what, I don't want to talk to comrades about my feelings, like I'm just not up for it, but they would willingly accept a donation so that they could then go and see like a confidential counselor to get like support for their emotional needs in a way that works for them. So I just think always centering that person and what they need and what suits them. And I know it's hard for people to know what they need often, but yeah, I just would say gentle, slow, and that person having as much power and control over the process as possible.
That was great, Nicole. This next question, I'll split it into two questions. It says, "Hi, Nicole, thank you so much for sharing all this with us. I wanted to ask if you could please elaborate on some of the specific legislation that the British state was enacting to suppress your movement. You mentioned this in one of your early slides."
Yeah. So they brought in new parts of this SOCPA Act, the Serious Organised Crime and Policing Act, which actually made it specifically illegal to target an animal research company or anyone connected to an animal research company. Yeah, I can like definitely dig up resources on that. I can't remember much about it on the top of my head, other than it was like specifically targeting vivisection. And it also reminded me that I forgot to name that like the Shack campaign was also active in the so-called United States and also experienced heavy repression as part of this kind of Green Scare, like broader repression of like earth and animal liberation movements. And like several people went to prison in the US as well as in the UK, and it was kind of like similar timescales. And shall I read the second bit of the question?
I'm happy to read it if that's helpful, or you're
that would be great.
Okay.
Go.
It says, "I also wanted to ask, what are your thoughts on the concept of resilience? I feel like it can become so fetishized as a means of pretending as though trauma hasn't actually affected us, or as though we're, quote, handling it, even when that can be far from the case."
Oh yeah, I love that. like I think I was also there once in terms of like, yeah, like you said, like fetishizing that word. I think I even wrote an article in the ALF supporters group newsletter about resilience to repression. And yeah, I think I also agree and have shifted to a perspective that it's like actually quite kind of like, yeah, almost like just quite gnarly in terms of the ableism, right? Of someone being able to express a certain amount of distress and someone else not expressing distress in quite the same way, but one of them being pathologized or like labeled as like not coping, and the other one like being labeled as like really strong or whatever. So yeah, I completely agree with like the critiques of it. And yeah, I'm aware there's like other questions, so I might just leave that one there. But I think it's kind of, I think like all of this language, like trauma informed, like this stuff, it's just getting used like to the point, or like mindfulness, like it's just, you know, being appropriated by capitalism to the point that it just doesn't feel meaningful anymore. Yeah.
A couple of questions more specifically about herbs. One of them was, it says, thank you so much for all of your love and labor. A clarifying question, the olive oil and lavender mixture, can it be ingested or is it for topical use?
Yeah, it's generally, it's not, it wouldn't really harm you, I don't think, eating it, but it's generally for topical use, because it's like a way of getting the oil like into your nervous system.
Another quick one is, have you found some, or maybe it's not quick, have you found some herbs or plants that are harmful or reduce abilities to heal trauma?
Ooh. I mean, I think that every medicinal plant has like its own kind of signature, which is like indicated for different people, whether that's like someone with a kind of constitution, or whether that's someone with like a spiritual affinity with a plant or an ancestral affinity with a plant. But I do think there are certain herbs in popular culture which are like kind of glorified like inappropriately from their traditional context. So for example, something like rhodiola or ashwagandha or these kind of adaptogens, they're often like extremely stimulating. And I personally think giving stimulants to someone who's already like hyper aroused is just like not a good idea. But you know, like some herbs also have these like restorative tonic effects, and if they're taken in a certain way in blends or in powders or with other herbs, then that can be mitigated. But I think like I think for me and my PTSD, like having these like very strong, like stimulating adaptogenic herbs have definitely been contraindicated. I also think sometimes some of the like sedative kind of hypnotic nervines can also not be appropriate. For example, if someone's experienced trauma while being sedated, for example, I'm not going to like name horrible examples, but I think people can probably imagine situations like that. Then yeah, having a herb that recreates that feeling is also not safe for that person in that particular moment in time. So yeah, that's why things like dosage is really important. And yeah, but generally I think, yeah, I would just encourage like intimacy with plants, like just finding out about them and their traditional context and their lineages and their medicinal properties, and yeah, whether they're kind of right for you and your constitution. Like I run very hot and dry, for example, so very heating herbs just aren't great for me. Whereas other people might run very cold and they absolutely adore and need like warming herbs and spices, for example. So yeah, but the Herbalism PTSD course like goes into the stuff in quite a lot of detail. Yeah.
Well, there was a question about the course that you offer. If someone was interested in the course but wasn't able to get into the course or attend it at the time that it was available, do you have any other herbalists or organizations that are doing similar work that you would recommend to people?
Yeah, like I think there are like I'm trying to think. There's someone called Brunham Warshaw who teaches about polyvagal herbalism and trauma, who's got really great politics and are a really good like clinical practitioner. I'm trying to sorry, I'm trying to think. Maybe when I put the video up, I'll put some links because I just can't think off the top of my head because my brain's a bit fried.
Great idea.
But yeah, I'm really sorry about the course having to be closed because it's not ideal, but it's just for me really, because I just have such overwhelming amounts of admin when launching the course that I kind of need to like structure that for myself twice a year. So yeah, but I'll
That makes a lot of sense. Maybe we have time for these last two questions here. One of the questions you could speak to about the UK specifically, it's certainly different in different places with different prisons. But the question was, how do you send herbal care packages to friends who are in prison? And how do you avoid them being confiscated? Does using an organization make it seem more legitimate? In the US, I think the sending an herbal care package almost universally would not be permitted across the state and federal prisons. However, there might be other means through an organization that people could access that kind of care potentially. But curious in the UK what the rules are for that.
It's an absolute no-go here as well. Like I would love it. Like I would be inundated if we could send care packages to people in prison. But the packages I send are like to defendants and prisoner families who are on the outside. And it's part of why I wrote the Prisoner's Herbal book, is like I wanted a way to support people in prison to like access plants, to work with them in creative, like low tech ways. Because it's also just not possible for us either. And yeah, maybe I'll pick up this other question or these other two questions because you said that they were the last ones. But yeah, there's a question: what kinds of rituals do you try when engaging with herbs with the community on addressing trauma and revolutionary healing? Yeah, I guess I kind of like don't, if that makes like I'm not I mean I am quite witchy, but I don't really like hold space like that, like energetically for people, if that makes sense. However, I know there's lots of beautiful herbalists that do, and again I'll try and put them in the resources section. Yeah, and and the other question was, I was wondering if you had any tips on working through the grief and pain of being abandoned by comrades in political organizing because of the reaction to trauma and pain was too difficult for others to handle. Oh, I wish I had an answer to this. If I'm honest, like the people who left me to get through that prison sentence on my own, it still causes me pain. It still makes me not trust them now, like 10 years later. Like I think it's really difficult. And I think I've tried to put my energy on working with people who I know I can trust, who I know will be by my side when I need them. And that's kind of earned over time. But I also have been trying to get to a place of like forgiveness of people who've maybe let me down or others down, and just trying to like set a better example of like refusing to abandon my own friends in prison, for example. But yeah, I think like trying again to like break through the machismo like in our scenes of actually being able to talk about our feelings like in a structured way. And I know movements like the Kurdish Freedom Movement, for example, have like tech mills, like they have infrastructure in order to kind of critique other people. And I think sometimes that's missing in our collectives. Like we're not able to say in a meeting, hey, you lunched me at an event and it meant that I was like super triggered and alone and it fucking sucked. Do you know what I mean? Like I think we need to be able to give each other that feedback more. And people need to be able to like receive feedback more. But yeah, I think the inevitability of feeling abandoned because you're like too much for someone, quote unquote, or your distress is too unbearable for people to witness. I think that is just a really broad cultural problem, right, within capitalism and how individualized we are and how excluded people are, like when they're in distress, you know, like how they're pushed to the margins, for example. So I think it is like a much bigger picture question, but I'm really grateful that you asked it. Check.
Thanks, Nicole. I will wrap up now, and I really want to appreciate everyone who shared the space and everyone who's going to listen later, because there's so much that's hard about what you said, and then there's so much that's so beautiful, and a lot of. I don't think I'm alone in just saying I'm so grateful for how much I learned and how much validation you offer and support, and really appreciate the work you do and you being here today. Thank you so much.
Oh, no, thank you. And I will do my best to put everything onto internet in the coming weeks.
Great. And I'll just, because people keep asking, in about a week or so, once someone voluntarily cleans up this recording, it can be available on Solidarity Apothecary website and also the CLDC website. And we'll share it on different signal threads for folks that are currently facing state repression through the Stop Cop City movement circles. And so thanks again.
Thank you both so much. Have a wonderful night. And thanks everybody who tuned in.
Thanks so much for listening to the Frontline Herbalism podcast. You can find the transcript, the links, all the resources from the show at solidarityapothecary.org/podcast.